In this video, I'm going to show you how to install a fork on a road bike or a cyclocross or gravel bike. And this will include cutting the carbon steer tube of the fork. Here's what you'll need to do this service. You're going to need the park cutting guide or some kind of cutting guide for bicycle forks if you're doing a carbon fork. Now this obviously works for aluminum as well. If you're installing a crown race on a fork, you're going to need a crown race setter. Now I've made one out of PVC and I made a video on how to make one of these, but this is my homemade crown race setter. You'll need a mallet also if you're setting the crown race on the fork. You'll need something to make a mark on the steer tube. I use a box cutter or a razor blade. You can also use a thin screwdriver. You're also going to need some safety glasses when you make your cut. If you're using the cutting guide, you're going to need a hacksaw. You'll want to use a dust mask, especially if you're cutting a carbon steer tube. If you don't have a dust mask, you can put your shirt over your mouth to make sure you don't inhale that carbon dust. If you own a shop vac, you'll want to use it, and I'll show you at what point in the procedure you'll use the shop vac. All right, the first thing that we're going to do is put the crown race on the fork. And you want to make sure that the bottom of the fork is clean. And then I always like to use a little bit of carbon safe grease. It makes the crown race go on a lot easier. So I'm just going to put a little bit on my fingers and just kind of put it down on the base of the carbon steer tube. Okay, so I'm just going to drop the crown race onto the fork, and then I'm going to put the fork on a mat, something that's safe for the fork. All right, so I'm just going to tap the top of my crown race setter, and we'll set the crown race onto the fork. After you get the crown race on the fork, just look and make sure you have no gap. In other words, make sure it's pressed all the way down onto the fork. Now we're going to install the fork on the bicycle so we can measure the length of the steer tube. So you're going to have to put all your bearings in. So I'm going to drop the bottom bearing on. And then you want to have everything kind of nearby on your workbench so you can grab it as you need it, because you're going to have to keep a hand on the fork. And then I'm going to put the top bearing on. So drop that in there. I'm going to drop this wedge on, and then the top cap. Now what I do is I will do 4 spacers. I put 2 on the bottom, 2 on the top. You always want to have at least 2 extra spacers on the top so that you can raise the stem if you need to. Because remember, when we cut this, you're not going to be able to add any length. So if you cut it too short, you're stuck with it. So I'm going to drop 2 spacers. So always run 2 spacers on the bottom. If you don't like any spacers, then you can just drop the stem on. So now I'm going to put my stem on the bike, and I'm going to add my 2 extra spacers. So this is my stack. Now I'm going to just tighten these bolts temporarily so that we can measure the steer tube. So again, we're just going to tighten this enough to keep the stem in place so we can get a measurement. Okay, before you do your mark, just pivot the fork and make sure the bearings are installed correctly. It should be very smooth. The spacers should be all the way down, so there should be no gaps. There shouldn't be a whole lot of play. There'll be a little bit because we haven't compressed the top cap, but there should not be a lot of play, and it should be smooth. Now we're going to make our mark, and just take your razor blade and just kind of score the carbon steer tube. And you should be able to see the mark, and if you lift the spacer, you should be able to see a mark right here. Remember the saying, measure twice, cut once. So after you have your mark and you know everything's set, just eyeball everything again. Make sure the fork's moving smoothly, make sure there's no gaps, and look at your mark again. Just make sure your mark is in the spot that you want. And that way you can get it exactly the way you want it. So I'm going to remove the fork from the bicycle, and we'll cut the steer tube. What we're going to do is we're actually going to cut a few millimeters below the mark, about the width of a small spacer. And the reason that we do that is so that when we put the top cap on and compress everything down, we've got enough space so it'll compress the fork and take out the play in the fork. Before I put the fork in the cutting guide, I'm going to go ahead and make a second mark. Again, about 2 to 3 millimeters below my original mark, and that way I can see it in the cutting guide. and that's going to show us exactly where to cut. So I've got the cutting guide in the bench vise, and I'm going to line up so I can see that mark. And I use a flashlight. It's kind of hard to see. In fact, it's almost impossible without a flashlight to see those marks come through the little slot there. Just a tip here, it's pretty obvious, but I want to say it anyway. When you put the fork in the cutting guide, you want to make sure that the main part of the fork is on this side, so the part that clamps down. That way, when you finish your cut, the fork doesn't fall off, the extra piece falls off. This is where if you have a shop vac, you'll want to use it. When you make the cut, you're going to have carbon fiber dust fall off. You want to make sure your mouth is covered. You want to make sure you have your safety glasses on, and if you have a shop vac, it really helps to absorb that so it's not flying around in the air. So I'm going to put my safety glasses on, I'll cover my mouth, and then I'll turn on my shop vac and make my cut. All right, now we have a nice freshly cut steer tube. Just take a rag, wipe off any excess carbon dust, and we'll put the fork on the bicycle. If your fork has a carbon steer tube, it's not going to use a star nut. It's going to use a compression cap like this. So I've got the bolt loosened up, and typically these will use a 6mm Allen bolt. So I'm going to drop that in, take my 6mm, and just tighten that down. Not crazy tight, but it does need to be pretty snug. And this is another reason why you want to make your cut a few millimeters below, because you can see that sticks up about 1 millimeter. So just like we did when we were measuring, going to put our bearings on, so the large bearing on the bottom. And by the way, when you put these bearings on, the more cone-shaped part always points towards the head tube. So on the bottom bearing, the cone shape goes up, and then on the top bearing, the cone shape goes down. And then we'll put our wedge on and the top cap, and oftentimes you'll have just a thin little spacer that goes on top of your wedge before you put your top cap on. And I call this a top cap. This is actually the bearing top cap to keep dust and things out of your bearings. So remember, I did 2 spacers, so I'll put those on. And I'll put my stem on, and I'll put my other spacers on. You should have a little bit of a gap sticking out the top of the last spacer, and that will give enough room for your top cap to press down. So that's again why you want to do about 3 millimeters gap between your mark and your actual cut. And then I'll just snug up the stem because I'm going to continue working on this bike. But that's it for cutting the steer tube and installing the fork. And then once I have the bike on the ground, I'll get the stem in the right position and everything. Now this will work for an aluminum steer tube as well. You go through the exact same procedure. You can cut an aluminum steer tube with a tube cutter. With a carbon steer tube, you have to use the cutting guide. Now I use a cutting guide for both aluminum and carbon, but again for carbon you have to use a hacksaw with a cutting guide. You cannot use a tube cutter. So any questions or comments that you have, go ahead and drop them below. Thanks for watching.